The first time Inez Cooper walked into the saloon at Caldwell, Kansas, every man in the room fell silent, and not one of them, not even the barkeep with his rag frozen mid-swipe, had the decency to stand up. It was the spring of 1879, and Caldwell sat just north of the Cherokee Strip like a wound that refused to close, a town stitched together from cattle money and desperate ambition. The Santa Fe Railway had pushed through the prior year, and with it had come the drovers, the gamblers, the land agents, and the outlaws who followed all three like buzzards trailing a herd. Dust was the town's permanent weather. Even on a clear afternoon, when the sky ran blue from one flat horizon to the other, the streets of Caldwell tasted of grit and horse and something metallic that nobody cared to name. Inez had arrived on the noon stage from Wichita. She was 26 years old, a widow of 14 months, and she carried everything she owned in a leather traveling trunk that had belonged to her late husband, Gerald. Gerald Cooper had been a good enough man, a schoolteacher from Ohio, who had answered an advertisement for educators in the new Kansas territories, and brought his young wife west with the confidence of someone who had never once considered that the land might not want him. He had lasted 3 years before a fever took him in the January cold, and it had taken Inez those 14 months since to sell the small house, settle the debts, and figure out what she was going to do with the rest of her life. What she had decided was this. Her younger sister, Clara, had married a rancher named Duff Whitmore who operated a spread 12 miles south of Caldwell. Clara's most recent letter had said there was room, that Duff was hiring on extra hands for the spring gather, and that Inez ought not to spend another winter alone in Wichita mourning a man who would have wanted her to live. So Inez had packed the trunk, bought a stage ticket, and here she was. The saloon was not her intended destination. The stage had let her off in front of it purely by geographic accident. The station office shared a wall with the Red Dog, and the driver had unhitched on the near side. She had stepped through the wrong door before she realized her mistake. The room smelled of sawdust and whiskey and the accumulated sweat of 100 afternoons. 3 long tables ran parallel to the bar, and every seat at every table was occupied. Men played cards. Men drank. Men told each other lies with complete sincerity. None of them moved, none of them except one. He was sitting at the far end of the nearest table, facing the door, his long legs stretched out under the table in the manner of a man who had decided the floor beneath belonged to him. He was perhaps 30, with a face that looked like it had been carved by someone who had run out of patience before they got to the soft parts, a jaw like a fence post, dark eyes set deep under a brow that stayed level even when everything else in a room was moving. He wore a coat of dark oilcloth despite the warmth, and a black hat that he did not remove when she entered, but tilted back slightly, just enough to see her clearly. On his left hip sat a Colt single-action Army revolver in a plain leather holster, worn smooth from use. He pushed back his chair and stood, not quickly, not with ceremony. He simply rose to his feet as though it were the only sensible thing to do when a woman walked into a room, and he pulled the empty chair beside him away from the table and set it at a slight angle toward her. "Ma'am," he said, "that was the whole of it." Inez Cooper stood in the doorway of the Red Dog Saloon with her hat slightly crooked from the stage ride and her traveling dress filmed with red dust, and she looked at the one man who had bothered to stand, and she felt something move in her chest that she had no immediate name for. "I believe I have the wrong door," she said. "Stage office is next door," he replied. "But if you need to sit down first, the chair is yours." The barkeep had recovered enough to stammer something, and a few of the other men shifted and mumbled, the way men do when they suddenly realize they have failed at something simple. But the damage to their social graces was already done. Only one man had stood, and every person in the room knew it. Inez looked at the chair. She looked at the man who had offered it. Then she crossed the room and sat down because her feet hurt from the stage and her back ached, and she was tired of pretending that she needed nothing from anyone. "Thank you," she said. He sat back down across from her, not beside her, which she appreciated. He picked up the playing cards he had been holding and set them face down on the table, which meant he was folding whatever hand he had. The other men at the table exchanged glances. "You heading to the Strip?" he asked, not demanding, just asking the way you ask about weather. "South of it. My sister's husband has a ranch," Whitmore spread. Something shifted in his expression, not much, just a fractional rearrangement of whatever was going on behind those dark eyes. "Duff Whitmore's place. You know him." "I know the territory," he said, which was not quite an answer. She looked at him more directly then, because something about his economy of words and the way the other men gave him that particular quality of space, not politeness, but caution, made her want to understand what she was sitting next to. "What is your name?" she asked. "Amos Collier." She did not recognize it immediately. She had not been long enough in Caldwell to have absorbed the local geography of reputation. But the barkeep dropped a glass, and two of the card players found reasons to look at their hands, and a man near the window turned his face toward the wall with studied casualness. "Inez Cooper," she said, because she was a woman who believed in equal exchange. "Mrs. Cooper," he said, noting the title she had not given him, which told her he had been paying attention. "Widow," she said, because she did not see the point in performing mystery about it. He nodded once, the way men nod when they've filed information and don't intend to use it carelessly. "I'll have someone bring your trunk to the station office. You shouldn't have to carry it." Before she could say that she was perfectly capable, he had already looked at a young man near the bar, a boy of about 17 with the angular alertness of someone trying to prove his usefulness, and made a gesture so small it barely qualified as movement. The boy was on his feet and through the door before Inez had formed a reply. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," said Amos Collier. She sat with him for perhaps 15 minutes, long enough to catch her breath and let the sweat from the stage ride cool. He did not talk excessively. He asked if she wanted water and had it brought. He told her the stage office clerk's name was Ferris, and that Ferris would know which wagons were heading south toward the Whitmore spread. He did not ask her anything about herself beyond what was relevant to getting her where she needed to go. When she stood to leave, he stood again. Automatic, like breathing. "Mr. Collier," she said, "you are either a very dangerous man or a very polite one. I cannot yet determine which." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved across his mouth. "In my experience, Mrs. Cooper, those two things are not always opposites." She walked out of the Red Dog Saloon into the bright Kansas afternoon and did not look back, because she was the sort of woman who had learned, through hard experience, that looking back too quickly at something interesting was the fastest way to trip over your own feet. But she thought about him. She thought about him in the stage office while Ferris, a round man with ink-stained fingers exactly as described, arranged her transport. She thought about him on the 12-mile wagon ride south through the long grass, with the sky going gold and purple ahead of her, and the wind carrying the scent of wild plum from somewhere she couldn't see. She thought about the way he had simply stood, as though it required no decision at all. Clara was waiting on the porch of the Whitmore ranch house when the wagon rolled in. She was 23, 3 years younger than Inez, and she had their mother's red hair and their father's stubbornness, and a happiness about her that came from having made a life she had chosen. She ran down the porch steps and caught Inez in an embrace that nearly knocked them both sideways. "You're here," Clara said into her shoulder. "You're finally here." "I'm here," Inez said, and held her sister until her arms stopped shaking from something she hadn't admitted was emotion until just that moment. Duff Whitmore was a broad-shouldered man of 35, honest in the blunt, efficient way of men who spent most of their time with cattle and horses. He shook Inez's hand firmly and told her she was welcome as long as she needed, which she understood to mean indefinitely, because he was not the sort of man to place conditions on family. He had a ranch hand named Pico who helped with the trunk, and a cook named Mrs. Bauer who appeared in the doorway with the particular expression of a woman who had just been given both extra work and purpose. That first evening, Inez sat on the porch with Clara and a cup of coffee and watched the stars come out over the flat Kansas dark. She told her sister about the stage, about the wrong door, about the saloon where no one had moved. And one man stood up, Clara said. One man offered me his chair. Who was he? Inez said the name, and Clara went still in the way that people go still when a name carries weight they weren't expecting. Amos Collier stood up. You know him. Clara set down her cup carefully. Inez, Amos Collier he's known all through this part of the territory. There are men in 3 counties who will cross the street rather than walk past him. He was a hired gun for a cattle baron up near Dodge for years, and before that, people say things. There are stories. Not all of them can be true, but enough of them are to make a person careful. He was perfectly decent to me, Inez said. I'm sure he was. That doesn't mean he isn't what they say he is. Inez considered this. What do they say specifically? Clara looked at her with the expression of a younger sister who recognizes when her older sister is already in some kind of trouble and trying to catalog it. They say he's never drawn on a man first. But they also say that no one who drew on him first is still around to dispute it. Inez said nothing more about it that night, but she filed the information in the same careful way she filed most things, not to judge yet, but to understand later. The ranch had its rhythms, and she fell into them. She was not a woman built for idleness, and Clara knew her well enough not to treat her like a guest once the first week passed. Inez helped with the cooking and the accounts. She had a head for numbers that Gerald had always relied on, and she learned the names of the horses and the shapes of the south pasture. She rode out with Clara sometimes in the mornings, before the heat of the day settled in. The land was enormous and strange in the way that flat country always is to people who came from somewhere with hills. It made you feel both exposed and infinite at the same time. She did not think about Amos Collier every day, but she thought about him more than she could fully justify, and on the days she rode into Caldwell with Clara for supplies, she found herself tracking the room whenever she entered a building, which was a new habit, and one she recognized as specific in its origin. She had been at the Whitmore Ranch for 3 weeks when she saw him again. It was a Thursday in early May, market day, when most of the ranches south of town sent wagons in for supplies, and the main street grew crowded enough to feel almost like a real city. Inez was in the dry goods store, comparing the price of 2 grades of flour and already knowing which one she would choose, but taking her time about it because the cooler air inside the store was preferable to the dust outside. She heard the quality of the noise on the street change. Not louder exactly, more focused, like the way a crowd murmurs before something happens. She looked out through the front window. Amos Collier was walking down the center of the main street in the particular way that men walk when they are not concerned about who sees them coming and have no intention of stepping aside for anyone. He wore the same dark coat, the same black hat. He moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had made a lifelong practice of using only as much energy as each situation required. Ahead of him, 3 men were clustered near the entrance to the hardware store. Even from inside the dry goods, Inez could read the body language, the tight-shouldered bravado of men who had been drinking since before noon and were arguing themselves into something they hadn't quite finished deciding on. One of them said something. She couldn't hear the words through the glass, but she saw the gesture, the aggressive lean forward, the chin up, the hand drifting toward a hip. Amos Collier stopped walking. He looked at the man for a moment with the attentive patience of someone giving a problem the consideration it deserved. Then he said something, short enough that it was probably fewer than 10 words. Whatever it was, the man's chin came back down. The cluster of 3 took a collective half-step back. The man's hand moved away from his hip. Amos Collier walked on. The whole exchange had taken perhaps 30 seconds. Nobody had drawn. Nobody had been hurt. But the 3 men stood with the particular stillness of people who had just come very close to something and needed a moment to remember how to breathe. Inez put down both grades of flour and chose neither for the moment. She walked out of the dry goods store into the bright street and found herself walking in the same direction as Amos Collier, because her feet made the decision before her better judgment could schedule a meeting to discuss it. He heard her coming, or perhaps sensed her. She had noticed that he was the kind of man who was aware of everything in a radius around him at all times, not nervously, just constantly, the way animals are that have learned to survive in open country. He stopped and turned when she was a few feet away. "Mrs. Cooper," he said, and there it was again, that slight rearrangement of his expression, not quite a smile, something warmer than his baseline. "Mr. Collier," she said, "that was well managed back there." He looked at her steadily. "You were watching. I was in the dry goods through the window. Those men weren't going to do anything," he said. "They were mostly talking." "Mostly." He looked at her for another moment. "You going back to the ranch today, this afternoon? Clara has the wagon." "Then let me buy you coffee," he said, "if you have the time." It was the most unpracticed, unadorned invitation she had ever received, and it landed with more force than any elaborate courtesy could have managed. "I have the time," she said. The coffee house was 3 doors down from the dry goods, a narrow establishment run by a German woman named Hedwig who kept everything very clean and charged fair prices and tolerated no nonsense. Amos Collier opened the door for Inez without ceremony, and they sat at a table near the window. Hedwig brought coffee without being asked, because she was that kind of proprietor, and looked at Inez with the small nod of a woman who notices things and keeps her observations to herself. "How are you settling in at the Whitmore place?" he asked. "Well enough. It's good to be near Clara." "Your brother-in-law is a fair man," Amos said. "Good to his people, runs a clean operation. You know Duff." "I know the territory," he said again, and this time she understood it a little better. He knew the territory the way a person knows a place they have spent years in, watching everything, learning who could be trusted, who could not, and cataloging it all for later use. "My sister told me about you," Inez said, because she was not a woman who could pretend she hadn't heard a thing she had clearly heard. Some of it anyway. He picked up his coffee cup. "What did she say?" "That men in 3 counties will cross the street to avoid you. 4 now," he said, without particular pride. "Since Meade County," she looked at him. "Does that bother you, the reputation?" He considered it with an honesty she had not expected. "Sometimes, but a reputation can keep more trouble from happening than it causes. If men believe a thing about you, they sometimes behave accordingly, which means you don't have to prove it. And if someone decides to test it—" His eyes met hers directly. They were very dark, and there was nothing hidden in them, which was its own strange kind of nakedness. "Then I prefer they test it in an empty street and not in a room full of people who have nothing to do with it." She thought about that for a moment. "That's an oddly protective way of thinking about violence." "Most things are more complicated than they first appear," he said. "Yes," she agreed, and meant several things by it. They talked for an hour. She told him about Gerald, about Ohio, about the years in Wichita, and he listened with the complete attention of a man who did not feel the need to fill silences with the sound of his own voice. He told her he was from Missouri originally, that he had come west young, that he had made choices he would not always choose again but could not honestly say he regretted, because they had made him who he was, and he had decided, somewhere along the way, to stand behind who he was rather than hide from it. "That's either admirable or frightening," she said. "Probably both," he agreed, and this time the thing that moved across his mouth was unmistakably a smile, and it changed his face entirely, broke through the carved severity of it like sunlight through cloud cover, and Inez Cooper felt something shift in her chest again, more distinctly this time. She thought, "Oh, this is what this is." She did not say so. She was a practical woman with a well-developed understanding of the difference between what she felt and what was wise to act on. But she held the knowledge carefully. The way you hold something you are not yet sure is breakable. Clara was waiting with the wagon at the hitching post outside the general store, and she raised her eyebrows with the particular eloquence of a younger sister who has spotted something. But she said nothing, because she was also a woman of some discretion. They drove home through the afternoon, and the prairie was golden and enormous, and the sky was the color of everything that could ever be hoped for, and Inez sat on the wagon bench and felt more alive than she had in 14 months. 2 days later, Amos Collier rode out to the Whitmore Ranch. He arrived in the mid-morning on a big bay horse that moved like it knew exactly what it was carrying. He stopped at the gate and removed his hat, which Inez saw from the kitchen window and which Clara noticed immediately and said nothing about with enormous deliberateness. Duff Whitmore went out to meet him, and Inez watched through the window as the two men talked for a moment. She could see the respect in Duff's posture, not the nervous kind, but the genuine kind, one capable man measuring another. Then Duff turned toward the house and called for Inez. She took off her apron. She went out. "Afternoon," Amos said, turning the brim of his hat slowly in his hands, which was the first piece of unguarded body language she had seen from him. It was small, but it was something. "I had business south of town and thought I'd ask if you needed anything from Caldwell. Sometimes the ranches run short between market days." It was a transparent excuse, and they both knew it, and the knowledge of that sat in the air between them with a gentle, almost pleasant weight. "We're well supplied," she said, "but thank you." He nodded. He looked at her. He looked at the hat in his hands. "Would you like to ride out? There's a stretch of creek about 2 miles east that's worth seeing this time of year. Wild plum is in bloom." Wild plum. She had smelled it on her first day from the wagon, unable to see the source. Something turned over very quietly in her chest. "I would like that," she said. Clara appeared in the doorway to say that she absolutely would not say anything, which she demonstrated by saying at some length how busy she was, and how she would not be watching them ride away, and how Inez should take her time. They rode east on horses Duff lent, because Inez's horse was a Whitmore Ranch animal, and Duff said to take it as though Amos had not already asked with his eyes. The morning was cool still, the grass bright with dew in the low places, and the sky was that particular shade of Kansas blue that looks painted. They rode mostly in comfortable quiet, which Inez had begun to understand was simply his native language, not coldness, not distance, but a fundamental comfort with silence that she found she did not mind. She had spent 3 years married to a man who filled every quiet space with words, which she had loved about Gerald, but which she also now recognized had sometimes been his way of not quite letting things settle. When they reached the creek, the wild plum trees were exactly what he had promised. A long corridor of white bloom along the bank, petals catching the light, and the smell of them was extraordinary, sharp and sweet and clean in a way that felt like something being returned. "Oh," she said, and stopped her horse. He stopped beside her and said nothing, which was exactly right. She looked at the trees for a long time, then she looked at him. "How did you find this place?" "I find most things eventually," he said. "I ride a lot alone." "Is that by choice?" He seemed to consider the question seriously. It was for a long time. He looked at the plum blossoms, and something in his profile went quiet in a different way. "I'm not entirely certain it still is." The air between them was very still. The creek made its small, persistent noise. A bird she couldn't identify sang somewhere in the trees. "Mr. Collier," she said. "Amos," he said, "if you're willing." "Amos," she said, and the word felt like stepping off a porch step onto ground that turns out to be solid. "What exactly do you want from coming to visit me?" He turned to look at her fully. His face was open in the way faces are when someone has decided the alternative costs too much. "I want to keep finding reasons to be near you. That's as honest as I can be about it." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is more honest than most men manage." "I've found that honesty costs less in the long run," he said. "And the reputation, the 4 counties, all of that, you understand that it gives a woman reason to be careful." "I understand it," he said. "I'm not asking you not to be careful. I'm asking you to take the time to learn whether the careful thing and the right thing are the same thing in this case." It was a well-constructed argument, and she told him so, and he laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that she had not heard from him before, low and warm, and it did something irreversible to the architecture of her feelings. "All right," she said. "I'll take the time." They rode back to the ranch in the early afternoon, and Clara met her on the porch with a cup of coffee and the expression of a woman who has decided to be patient, because the situation is clearly managing itself satisfactorily. Over the weeks that followed, Amos Collier became a regular feature of the space around the Whitmore Ranch. He came always with purpose. He helped Duff trace a fence line that had been disputed by a neighboring claimant. He rode out with the hands during a stretch of days when a cougar had been taking calves from the south herd. He brought Mrs. Bauer a crate of dried apples from a merchant he'd done business with in town, because she had mentioned once in passing that she was running low. And he came for Inez. Not always obviously. Not in the way of men who arrive with declarations and expect immediate results. He came the way water moves, finding the paths, patient, persistent, wearing at things gradually but without dishonesty about what it was doing. They rode together often. He taught her to read the land in the ways she hadn't learned, where the weather built, how to understand the behavior of the grass, what the different patterns of bird movement meant. She taught him things in return that surprised him. She had learned to set type from a printer in Wichita and could identify more wildflower species than anyone he had met, and she had strong and well-reasoned opinions about everything from water rights to the railway company's treatment of settlers that she delivered without apology. Liked that about her. She could see that he liked it, not the pleased tolerance of a man who finds a woman's opinions charming precisely because he doesn't take them seriously, but genuine engagement, the way a man engages with something that makes him think. "My father wanted sons," she told him once, sitting on the bank of the Plum Blossom Creek in early June, where the trees had gone to leaf and the water was running clear and cold. "He got 2 daughters, and he taught us both everything anyway. He said the land didn't care what you were, only whether you were paying attention." "Your father was right," Amos said. "He would have liked you," she said, and then wondered if she had said too much. But she had said it and she didn't take it back. He looked at her steadily. "Tell me about him." So she did. She talked about her father for an hour, and somewhere in the middle of it Amos reached over without announcement and took her hand, and she let him, and neither of them remarked on it, and the afternoon sat around them like something that had finally gotten what it was waiting for. It was Duff who said something first, which surprised Inez, because she had assumed it would be Clara. He found her one evening sitting on the porch after supper, working on a letter to a friend back in Wichita, and he pulled up the other chair and sat with her for a moment in the way that men who don't talk much choose their moments carefully. "Collier's a good man," Duff said, "whatever they say about him." "I know," said Inez. "He hasn't always had easy choices. Out here, the easy choice and the right choice don't always arrive together." "I understand that." Duff nodded, satisfied with having said what he came to say. He went back inside. Clara appeared in the doorway a moment later with the expression of a woman who had sent her husband on a mission and wanted a report. "He said what needed saying," Inez told her. Clara smiled. "Good, because you need to stop pretending you're being cautious when what you actually are is scared." "I'm not scared," Inez said. "You're a little scared." Inez looked at her letter, which was about nothing much, which she had been writing for 20 minutes and hadn't finished a paragraph of. "A little scared," she admitted. "Of what specifically?" She thought about it seriously. "That something will happen to him. He lives in a particular way, Clara, out in the open. He doesn't hide from what he is. That's admirable, but it's also dangerous," Clara supplied. "Yes." Clara sat down in the chair Duff had vacated. "Gerald was a schoolteacher in Ohio, and a fever took him at 34 in a Kansas winter. There's no safe arrangement, Inez. There's only what's real and what you choose to do with it." Inez was quiet for a moment. "You're wiser than you look." "I know," said Clara, completely without modesty. Inez folded her unfinished letter and put it away and sat with her sister in the good warm dark and let herself know, without equivocation, that she was in love with Amos Collier. She told him so the following Sunday. They had ridden out to the high ground east of the creek, where you could see for 30 miles in clear weather. and the afternoon was so clear and still that the distant line of cottonwoods along the Arkansas River was visible as a faint dark thread on the horizon. She had been turning it over in her mind for days. How to say it, whether to say it, what followed from saying it, and she had eventually concluded that there was no intelligent way to manage it, and that the only option was simply to say the thing. "I am in love with you," she said, looking at the horizon, not at him, which was a compromise between honesty and nerve. The silence lasted long enough that she turned to look at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Fully unguarded, all the careful arrangement dissolved, something almost stricken in it, like a man who has been told that what he wanted most in the world is real and finds the news almost too large to contain. "Inez," he said, just her name, but the way he said it. "You don't have to," she began. "I have been in love with you since you walked out of the Red Dog and told me I was either dangerous or polite," he said, and his voice had a roughness in it that she had never heard before. "I have thought about almost nothing else since that afternoon. I have been trying to give you time to decide, and I have been running out of reasons not to say it, and you just said it first, so," she said. "So I love you," he said. "I love you without question or reservation, Inez Cooper, and I would like your permission to do something about that." She looked at him in the 30-mile afternoon light on the high Kansas ground and thought this. "Yes, this. What did you have in mind?" she asked. "Marrying you eventually if you're willing," he said. "But I'll start with this." Yes. He reached across and cupped her face in his hands, which were large and calloused and very gentle, and he kissed her once slowly, with the particular care of a man who has thought about a thing long enough to want to do it right. She kissed him back and thought that the Kansas sky was very beautiful and that her father had been right, and that the land did not care what you were, only whether you were paying attention. They were engaged the following month. Amos Collier rode out to the Whitmore Ranch on a morning in late June carrying two things: a ring that had belonged to his mother, a plain gold band set with a chip of garnet, and a very clear intention. He asked Duff's blessing as a courtesy, though Inez had already said yes in principle, and Duff gave it with a handshake that said more than most speeches. Clara cried in the unself-conscious way of women who are genuinely happy and see no reason to pretend otherwise. Mrs. Bauer made a cake without being asked, which was how you knew the news was good. It was not all uncomplicated. There were things that needed to be said and said honestly, and Amos said them in the evenings on the porch of the Whitmore Ranch, in the space after supper that had gradually become his and Inez's hour. He told her about the years before Caldwell. He told her about the work he had done for the cattle baron named Fentress up near Dodge, work that had been legal in the technical sense but not in the moral sense, he said, because there was a difference, and he had come to know it too slowly. He told her that he had ridden away from that work 4 years ago and had not taken a gun for hire since. He told her about the men who had drawn on him. He told her the number. He said it plainly without either bravado or excessive guilt because the plain truth required neither. She listened to all of it. When he was finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Do you believe you're a good man?" she asked. "I believe I'm trying to become one," he said. "I think that's more honest than claiming the destination when you're still on the road." "That's enough for me," she said. "More than enough." He let out a breath that he had been holding without knowing it. "I have a condition," she said. He looked at her. "The gun stays on your hip because this is Kansas and it would be foolish to go unarmed, and I'm not asking you to be foolish," she said. "But I need to know that you're not riding toward trouble anymore. That if trouble comes, you handle it, but you're not the one calling it in." "That was already true," he said. "It's been true for 4 years, but I'll say it plainly to you now. No more riding toward it. I'm done with that." She took his hand. "All right then." They set the wedding for September, which was practical timing. The worst of the summer heat would have passed, the fall gather would be approaching, and Duff had offered to stand as witness, with Clara and Mrs. Bauer and the ranch hands making up the assembled party. They arranged for the circuit preacher, a straightforward man named Reverend Hayward who came through Caldwell every 6 weeks and believed in brief ceremonies and long marriages. August brought heat like a pressing iron, and with it came the complication that was perhaps inevitable given the territory and the names involved. His name was Tanner Dale, and he was exactly the sort of man who caused the problems that other men then had to solve. He had ridden into Caldwell from the Colorado border with 2 other men, and a grievance that was 3 years old and belonged not to him, but to a cousin who was, by all reliable accounts, alive and well in Pueblo, but whose perceived dishonoring at the hands of one Amos Collier in a card game in 1876 was being held up as justification for all kinds of current ambition. Inez heard about it from the dry goods proprietor's wife, who heard it from the barkeep at the Red Dog, who heard it from 2 different sources on the same afternoon, which is how you knew it was the kind of thing people were paying attention to. She told Amos that evening on the porch. She told him plainly, because she had made a decision somewhere in these months to be the kind of woman who gave the man she loved information rather than managing him by withholding it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Tanner Dale," he said, mostly to himself. "Do you know him?" "No, I know the cousin. It was a fair game and the cousin knew it." He was angry because he was embarrassed. 3 years is a long time to stay angry about a card game. "Some men have no other investments," Amos said, which was so dry and so precise that she almost laughed. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Go into town, talk to Sheriff Driscoll, let the law be the law." She looked at him. "And if the law is insufficient, then I'll handle it," he said. "But in the street, in the open, not anywhere near you or this ranch or these people." She believed him. Not blindly. She had moved past the blindness stage and was operating on the far more durable basis of evidence and character, but genuinely. She believed him because she knew him now, and what she knew was that he meant what he said. He rode into Caldwell the next morning. He was gone most of the day. When he came back in the early evening, he was unhurt and had the contained, settled air of something resolved. "What happened?" she asked. Tanner Dale and his friends had a conversation with Sheriff Driscoll and decided that Caldwell, Kansas in August was not where they wanted to spend any more time, he said. They left on the North Road at midday. She studied him. "That's all. The sheriff is an efficient man," Amos said, and Tanner Dale was capable of arithmetic. 3 men against the sheriff's office, with whatever else might be waiting for them in town, the arithmetic wasn't favorable. "Whatever else might be waiting for them," she repeated. He met her eyes. "I was visible on the main street. Sometimes visibility is sufficient." She shook her head, but she was fighting the urge to smile because it was that familiar and particular thing, the reputation doing its work, keeping the peace without a shot fired. 4 counties, she said. "Possibly 5 now," he said. "Depending on how Tanner Dale tells the story when he gets back to Colorado." She laughed, and he smiled the real smile, the one that broke through the stone of his face like something living, and she put her hand on his chest over his heart and felt it beating steadily under her palm. "September cannot come fast enough," she said. "No," he said, "it cannot." September came. The morning of the wedding was bright and still, the first real cool day after the long August, with a sky that looked freshly washed and the smell of turning grass on the air. Mrs. Bauer had been cooking since before dawn. The ranch hands had washed their faces and combed their hair and achieved varying degrees of presentability. Clara had helped Inez into the one good dress she had saved from her life before, cream-colored, simple, altered in the sleeves where she had grown stronger from months of ranch work. Inez stood in the small room at the back of the ranch house that Clara had given her, looking at herself in the mirror, and thought of Gerald briefly, not with grief, but with something gentler. She wished him peace and thanked him. In the private way, you thank the experiences that made you who you are, and then she let him go, completely and with love, and turned to meet what was in front of her. Amos was waiting outside under the big cottonwood that shaded the front of the ranch house. He had cleaned up in a way that was thorough without being unrecognizable. His dark coat, freshly brushed, and a shirt that was actually white, and his hat in his hands rather than on his head, which she had come to understand was his way of showing respect to the moment. He had shaved clean, which made him look simultaneously more severe and more vulnerable, and when he saw her coming down the porch steps, the expression on his face was the most undefended thing she had ever seen. Reverend Hayward was a small, energetic man who seemed to understand that the people in front of him didn't need lengthy instruction in what they were doing and said so, briefly and kindly, before moving efficiently through the ceremony. Duff stood at Amos's side. Clara stood at Inez's, and she cried again from the beginning this time, not even pretending she wouldn't. When Reverend Hayward reached the vows, Amos spoke them in the same direct, unhurried voice he used for everything, but with a gravity that made them sound not like recitation but like declaration, each word placed with full intention. Inez spoke hers steadily, looking at him, meaning every syllable. When it was done, Amos put the garnet ring on her finger, and she held his hand in both of hers for a moment before letting go, because she wanted to, and because this was the day for wanting things and doing them. He kissed her in front of everyone present, which was not a small kiss, and the ranch hands cheered, and Clara cried harder, and even Duff made a sound that might have been a cheer if it had decided to complete itself. Mrs. Bower's food was extraordinary. There was dancing, which required that someone play music, which turned out to be a ranch hand named Ezra who had a fiddle in his bunkhouse, and was considerably better at it than anyone had expected. The afternoon went golden and long, and Inez danced with her husband in the yard of her sister's ranch while the prairie sat enormous and generous around them. Husband. The word sat in a new and different place than it had the first time. This time it felt earned. They had found Amos a place. He had, over the months of their acquaintance, been staying at a boarding house in Caldwell, a practical arrangement for a man who had been essentially nomadic. But in the weeks before the wedding, he had bought a parcel of land 3 miles from the Whitmore Ranch, a small claim with a creek-fed meadow and a timber stand, and enough flat ground to build on. The house was simple, 1 room and a lean-to kitchen, built by hired labor and his own hands over the summer months. It was not grand. It was solid. That was where they went after the wedding, as evening came on and the stars emerged one by one from the purple Kansas dark. The ride was 3 miles and the night air was cool, and the horses moved at an easy pace, and Amos and Inez rode side by side with their arms almost touching, and neither of them said much because there was no particular need to. The house smelled of new lumber, and the dried wildflowers Clara had brought over 2 days before and left in a jar on the table. Amos had laid a fire before he left that morning, and it needed only a match. The light came up warm and immediate. "It's good," Inez said, looking around. "It'll be better," he said. "Give me time." "I have time," she said. He crossed the room to her and took her face in his hands the way he had on the high ground that June afternoon, and he looked at her with the full, unguarded expression that he saved for her and only for her, and she put her hands over his and held them. "Inez Collier," he said, trying it out. "Inez Collier," she agreed. The fire crackled. The prairie outside the one window went fully dark. The night was complete and quiet and entirely theirs. The first winter in their house was hard in the way that first winters in new places tend to be, not catastrophically, but instructively. There were things to learn about how the cold settled in the low spots of the meadow, how the chimney drew unevenly in a north wind, how the creek ran slow and then silent and then slow again. Amos knew most of it already, from winters spent in rougher arrangements than this. But knowing it himself and sharing it with someone were different things, and he discovered in those cold months that explaining what he knew to Inez was among the more satisfying experiences he had had in his life. She learned fast and remembered everything, which he had come to expect from her and admired without diminishment. She would ask a question, hear the answer, apply it, and never need to ask again. She also told him when she thought he was wrong about something, directly and without performance, and she was right often enough that he had stopped being surprised by it. They went to the Whitmore Ranch for Christmas, and Mrs. Bauer made a feast, and Duff and Amos sat by the fire after supper and talked in the way of men who have found each other genuinely useful and have stopped needing to verify it. Clara and Inez sat together in the easy silence of sisters who have been through enough to be simply glad of proximity. "Are you happy?" Clara asked at one point quietly. Inez looked at her husband across the room, where he was describing something to Duff with more words than he usually used, which meant he was engaged and genuinely interested. He glanced up as though he felt her looking, and the slight shift of his face was just for her. "Enormously," she said. In February, she told him she was pregnant. He went very still in the way he went still when something had surprised him past his usual composure, not the trained stillness of a man who has decided not to react, but the stillness of a man whose system has briefly exceeded its processing capacity. Then he took her hands in both of his very carefully and looked at her, and his face was the face she had seen in the wedding day, the most undefended version of him, full of something enormous and wordless. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm sure." He brought her hands to his lips and held them there for a long moment, and she put her forehead against his, and they stayed like that in the kitchen of their small house, while the February wind pushed at the walls, and the fire gave its warmth, and the world outside was cold and dormant, and entirely unconcerned with the extraordinary thing happening inside. "I don't know how to do this," he said eventually, meaning fatherhood, she understood, which was more honest than most men would manage. "Neither do I," she said, meaning motherhood. "We'll learn. We're fairly good at learning," he said. "We are," she agreed. They told Clara and Duff on a Sunday in March, when the snow was still on the ground but the angle of the light had begun its imperceptible shift toward spring. Clara's response was immediate, physical, and loud. Duff shook Amos's hand for longer than the usual, and Amos let him, which Inez recognized as its own kind of expression. The pregnancy was unremarkable in most of the ways that mattered, no serious complications, no unusual difficulties, just the steady, strange process of a person being assembled in the dark. Inez continued doing most of what she normally did, with adjustments, because she was not a woman who believed in preemptive surrender to discomfort. Amos fretted more than he showed, which she saw clearly and did not comment on, because she understood that his care expressed itself in action rather than word. And so she let him do the additional things. He took on riding to town for supplies, rather than sending one of the hands, checking the water level of the creek at times that weren't strictly necessary, fixing a dozen small things around the house that had been fine before but which he suddenly found inadequate. "You're building a fortress," she told him in June, watching him reinforce the gate of the fence that enclosed the kitchen garden. "The gate was loose," he said, without turning around. "The gate has always been loose. You didn't notice it until February." A pause. "It bothered me in February." She sat down on the porch step with her coffee and watched him work and loved him with a completeness that still, after a year of practice, occasionally caught her off guard. The baby came in the middle of August, when the heat was back and the nights were long and warm. It was a boy, which surprised neither of them because Inez had had a conviction about it since March that she couldn't explain and had been right about. They named him Elias, which had been Amos's father's name, and also because it was solid and unambiguous, the kind of name that would serve a person in a territory where you needed names that people didn't have to ask twice to understand. Clara was there for the birth, and Mrs. Bauer came over uninvited and was indispensable. Amos stayed close through all of it and managed the borderline between being present and being intrusive with a carefulness that Inez noticed, and that Mrs. Bauer later told Clara was the mark of a man worth keeping. When it was done and the room had quieted and Inez was sitting up in the bed with Elias in her arms, Amos came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with the expression that Inez had seen crossing his face over the previous 7 months in fragments and anticipations. The complete undone openness of it, The way this enormous carved stone face simply came apart at the sight of this small, red-faced, furious person he had had a hand in creating. "Hello," he said to Elias, as though introducing himself, as though being polite about it. Elias made the sound that new babies make, which is the sound of a person encountering the world and having significant opinions about it immediately. "He's loud," Amos said. "He takes after me," Inez said. Amos looked at her, and his smile came out full and unguarded and brilliant. "That's the best news I've heard all day," he said. Inez Collier grew, as babies do, with astonishing speed and a complete indifference to the schedules of anyone around him. He was a strong child, dark-eyed like his father and quick-minded like his mother, and he had an expression at 4 months that suggested he was already forming opinions about everything he saw. Amos was, it turned out, a natural with him in the particular way of people who are not performatively good with children but genuinely interested in them as small, complicated persons. He talked to Elias the way he talked to Inez, directly, without condescension, as though whatever the child was communicating deserved a real response. He carried him in the evenings when the baby was restless and walked outside with him, even in the cooler weather, telling him the names of things. The stars, the grass, the shapes of the distant trees. Inez watched this from the doorway sometimes and felt something deep and warm settle in her permanently. The territory continued to be the territory. There were disputes over grazing rights and water access, which were the constant background noise of ranching country. There was a difficult winter the following year that killed cattle and tested everyone. There was the ongoing business of the railroad expanding further south, and the complicated questions it raised about land that various parties had been using in various ways. Amos had fully stepped away from his former life in the way he had promised. He was not a hired gun anymore, and when the reputation still arrived before him in a new place, he let it do its work and then demonstrated by his actual behavior that it was incomplete information. Caldwell learned him over time as a man who would settle a dispute fairly and thoroughly and then go home. Sheriff Driscoll, who was a smart man, appreciated this, and they came to an understanding that was never formally articulated but was solid as anything in the county. He built onto the house in the spring of their 2nd year, a proper bedroom, a larger kitchen, a second room for Elias that would do for however many more Elias might eventually be joined by. He did much of the work himself, with help from 2 of the Whitmore Ranch hands on the heavier tasks, and Inez helped with what she could, and they worked side by side on warm evenings after Elias was down and talked about the house and the land and what they wanted it to become. "I'd like a garden," she said one evening, looking at the south side of the house. "Not just the kitchen garden, something with flowers." "Plant whatever you want," he said from where he was measuring planks. "I want roses," she said. "People say you can't grow them out here, but I read that it's possible if you choose the right variety." "You'll figure it out," he said, with the complete confidence of a man who has yet to observe Inez Cooper fail to figure something out she had decided to figure out. She planted roses the following spring. They took. By the summer of their 3rd year together, there was a row of them along the south fence, deep red and obstinate and beautiful, blooming in the Kansas heat like a piece of stubbornness made visible. The second baby was a girl. They named her Myra, after Inez's mother, which was Inez's idea but which Amos embraced without hesitation, and with a warmth that made her love him all over again. Myra came into the world the April of their 4th year with less drama than Elias had managed, and an expression of serene certainty that suggested she had arrived exactly when and how she intended to. She was lighter than Elias, with Inez's coloring and the same directness of gaze that both her parents shared. Elias was nearly 3 by then, and his initial investigation of his sister was thorough and ambivalent, settling over the course of a week into an ownership that was really affection in the form available to 2-year-olds. He brought her things, repeatedly: a wooden horse, a piece of grass, a small, smooth stone that she showed no interest in but which he appeared to consider appropriate. He's courting her, Amos said, watching. He's 3, Inez said. He's a Collier, Amos said. We start early. She laughed and tucked herself into his side on the settle, and he put his arm around her, and they watched their children in the afternoon light of their own house, and the moment was so complete in itself that it required nothing added. In the autumn of that year, a man came to Caldwell looking for Amos. Not with violence, not with a grievance old or new. His name was Hartley, and he was a land agent from the eastern part of the state, and he had been sent by a consortium of investors who were interested in developing the southern part of the territory and wanted to retain Amos as a kind of negotiator, a man who could represent them with the ranchers and homesteaders along the strip, because his name carried weight and his honesty was known. Amos read the letter twice at the kitchen table and put it down and looked at it. "What do you think?" he asked Inez, who was standing at the counter with Myra on her hip and a clear view of his face. "I think it's legitimate work," she said carefully, "and I think it's the kind of thing where your reputation would serve a purpose you could actually feel good about. But I also think you need to ask what they want you to say to those ranchers and homesteaders before you agree to say it." He looked at her. "The railway companies and certain land interests have not always been fair to the people who settled this land in good faith," she said. "If this consortium intends to use you to smooth over something unjust, that would be different from using you to negotiate something genuinely fair." He nodded slowly. "I'd need to read the full terms." "You'd need to read the full terms and also go out and talk to the ranchers yourself first before you agree to anything, so you know what you're walking into." He was quiet for a moment. "You should be the negotiator," he said. "I have a baby on my hip," she said. "You could negotiate with a baby on each hip," he said, "and do better than most men I've known." She handed Myra to him, which he received with the easy competence of a man who had made himself entirely comfortable with the practical requirements of fatherhood, and she sat down at the table and pulled the letter toward herself. She read it carefully. "There's a provision here," she said, pointing, "about existing grazing agreements. If this is honored in the final arrangement, that protects Duff and 6 other ranchers in the county who have had those agreements for 20 years. That's significant. Is it in writing?" "It's in this letter. Whether it makes it to the final contract is a different question." He looked at the baby in his arms, who was regarding him with the serene competence that seemed to be Myra's permanent disposition. Then he looked at Inez. "Come with me to the meetings," he said. "Amos, you read faster than I do, and you see things in language that I miss. Myra is 4 months old. Clara will take her for a day when we need. Come with me." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're asking me to help you do your work." "I'm asking you to be my partner in all of it," he said. "That's what I intended from the start. I just want to say it plainly now." She was quiet with something full and real for a moment. Then she said, "All right, I'll come." They met with Hartley and the investors, and Inez came, and the investors were visibly uncertain about this arrangement, until she asked 3 questions in the first 10 minutes that none of them had answers for, at which point their uncertainty changed shape into a different kind of attention. The provision about grazing agreements made it into the final contract. So did 2 other protections she had identified in the interim period, for water access and for notice periods on any land reassignment. It was not a perfect arrangement. Land development in the territory was not a process that anyone came out of with entirely clean hands, and Inez knew that and said so to Amos on the ride home after the last meeting. But it was better than it would have been, and the people it affected most had been given fair representation, and that was the difference between a thing you could live with and a thing you couldn't. Duff thanked Amos at Christmas that year, briefly, and with a directness that communicated the depth of it without excess. Amos said it had been Inez's work as much as his, which Duff already knew, because Clara had told him everything in detail, and Duff said that was what he expected and that they made a good team, which was both true and exactly the right thing to say. Time did what time does. It moved through the country and the people in it, changing things and not changing things, depositing sediment. The small house on Amos's claim became a real house, then a good house, and then something that had started to look like the place it was always trying to become. The rose garden along the south fence spread and improved and became a thing that people mentioned when they spoke about the Collier place, a piece of beautiful improbability that Inez kept blooming in the heat through stubbornness and attention. Elias started at the school in Caldwell when he was 6, riding in with Amos on market days, and picked up by Clara's eldest, who was 3 years older and had constituted himself as a kind of honorary cousin. He was a serious student who asked his teacher the kind of questions that made teachers either delighted or exhausted, depending on their character. His teacher, a patient young man from Illinois, was mostly delighted. Myra showed, at 3, 4, and 5, a dedication to horses that eclipsed everything else in her sphere of interest. She had been put on a horse at 2.5 by Duff, who said she had asked him to with the clarity of a person who knows what they want, and she had sat perfectly still and looked around at the world from that new height with an expression of complete satisfaction. By 5 she was riding independently on a small gray mare and conducting herself with a composure that made her look, Amos said, like a small version of someone who had been doing this for 40 years. "She gets that from you," Inez told him. "She gets that from you," he said. "I wasn't that composed at 5. I was considerably more chaotic." "I believe that completely," she said. "There were hard times, as there are always hard times. A summer drought that cut the hay yield in half and meant a difficult winter. A bout of sickness that went through the ranch hands and for a week had Inez genuinely frightened, because Elias caught it and ran a fever for 4 days that reminded her, with a cold-handed clarity, of Gerald and the winter in Wichita. She had not thought of Gerald often in those years. Not with grief, just occasionally with the grateful acknowledgement of having been loved by someone good, before being loved by someone who had changed the entire shape of her life. Amos sat with Elias through those 4 nights, not sleeping, not leaving except for the minutes it took to check on Myra and bring back water. He talked to Elias in the low, direct voice he used for things that mattered, told him things. The names of rivers he had crossed, the shapes of the states, the stories he had been told about the land, the way weather built in the north and moved south through the season. Elias slept and woke and slept and listened in that half-conscious way of sick children, who can hear the voice of someone they trust and be comforted by the sound even when the words blur. On the 5th morning the fever broke and Elias asked for breakfast, and Amos came out to the kitchen where Inez was standing at the stove, and she turned and saw his face and went to him, and he held her with the tight, contained feeling of a man who has been holding something very carefully for 4 days and can finally let himself know that it is safe. "He's all right," she said into his shoulder. "He's all right," he agreed, in a voice slightly less steady than his usual. "You didn't sleep. I'll sleep tonight." She held him a moment longer. "Thank you," she said. "He's my son," Amos said simply, as though this explained everything, which it did. The years built on themselves, and the Collier family took root in the South Kansas country, the way things take root when they are in the right soil. The small claim became a proper ranch, not large by the standards of the big cattle operations, but well-run and solid, because Amos was methodical about it, and Inez had the head for the business side that made the difference between a ranch that survived bad years and one that didn't. They ran a modest herd and sold to the rail yards in Caldwell, and the prices fluctuated the way prices fluctuate, and the weather did what Kansas weather did, and they managed, and more than managed. The rose garden became something people came to see. This was Inez's doing, and also slightly beyond her doing, in the way that things sometimes exceed the original intention and become their own entity. She had written to a botanist she heard about in Kansas City who specialized in hardy varieties, and he had written back with specific recommendations. And over the years she had added and refined until the south fence was a remarkable thing, all-season color and scent, entirely without precedent on a working ranch in the Cherokee Strip country. She wrote about it, eventually. A letter to a women's journal in Kansas City that published practical advice and observations. The journal printed it and asked for more, and Inez Collier became an occasional contributor to that journal for the next decade, writing about gardening in the territory, about the land, about the particular quality of life in a place that was still making itself. She never wrote about Amos directly, but the people who knew her could see him in every piece, in the way she wrote about stability and permanence and the value of building things that last. When Elias was 12 and Myra was 9, Inez told Amos she was expecting again. He was older now, past 40, the gray starting at his temples in the way that made him look distinguished in a way she told him about, and he never quite believed. He received the news with the same stillness as the first time, broken by the same dissolving of his face into something completely open, and he said, "Are you sure?" Exactly as he had with Elias, and she said yes, exactly as she had. And the kitchen was warm and the fire was going, and Elias was outside somewhere with the horses, and Myra was reading on the porch, and everything was very real and good. "3," he said. "3," she agreed. Is that he looked at her carefully because he had learned over these years to ask rather than assume. "Is that all right, what you want?" "It's very much what I want," she said. "Is it what you want?" He crossed the kitchen to her and put his hands on her face and kissed her forehead and then her mouth, gently and completely. "Yes," he said against her lips. The third child was another boy, born the following June, healthy and loud, and with an expression that Duff, who was there, said was the exact image of Amos at what must have been his loudest and most demanding. They named him Samuel, and Elias was at the age to be genuinely interested in a younger sibling rather than merely tolerant, and Myra was at the age to be competent about it, and Samuel entered a household that was already a world and made it larger by the force of his specific, individual being. There is a particular quality to a life that has built itself into what it was meant to be. It doesn't feel finished, because no good life feels finished while it's being lived. It feels like a river that knows where it's going, not slow, not still, but moving with the confidence of something that has found its course. The morning that Inez Collier decided was the most extraordinary, ordinary morning of her life. She was 38 years old. She had gotten up before dawn, which she still sometimes did, because the quality of the light on the Kansas prairie at the moment between dark and day was something she had never fully stopped being amazed by. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the sky go from black to deep blue to the first thin copper at the edge. Amos came into the kitchen in the quiet way he had always moved, present without announcement, and he poured his own coffee and stood beside her at the window. They stood there together, and the land outside did its slow, enormous, beautiful thing, and Samuel was asleep down the hall, and Elias was at the Caldwell school, and Myra was out to the barn because she had been up since first light on a day when her gray mare was being difficult about something, which was their regular negotiation. "I was thinking," Inez said, watching the light change. "Tell me," he said, "about the morning I walked through the wrong door in Caldwell, 9 years ago." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the light. "I think about it too," he said. "The stage had been late. If it had been on time, I would have left before you arrived." "That's a terrifying thought," she said. "It is," he said, "so I try not to follow it too far. I think about what would have happened if you hadn't stood up," she said, "if you just sat there the way everyone else did." "I couldn't have," he said simply. "Why not?" He looked at her with the full, unguarded expression that had never lost its power over her, that she still sometimes caught herself studying, still finding new things in it after years of looking. "Because you walked in," he said, "and the room did nothing, and that was wrong, and I have never been good at leaving wrong things uncorrected when there's something simple I can do about them." She looked at him. "That's your explanation for all of it, isn't it? Everything you've ever done?" "Most of it," he said. She put her hand on his chest, over his heart, as she had done 1,000 times over 10 years, feeling it beat steady under her palm, real and present and entirely hers. He put his hand over hers. Outside, the light was fully gold now, pouring over the long grass, catching the red of the roses along the south fence where they were already in bloom this early summer, improbable and brilliant and precisely where she had put them. Down the hall, Samuel made the sound of a child beginning to wake up, which had a particular music to it. Amos looked toward the sound and back at her, and they shared the look of parents who have a limited amount of time remaining in the quiet, which was fine, which was more than fine, because the noise was Samuel, who was 2 years old and the current center of several universes at once. "I'll get him," Amos said. "We'll both go," she said. And they went together down the hall of their house, on their land, under the Kansas sky that was now full and blazing with everything that the day was going to be. And Samuel Collier was standing up in his crib with the absolute certainty of a child who knows that someone is coming, has always known it, will always know it, because the people who built this life had built it so completely and so well that it held and would hold, through weather and time, and whatever the territory decided to send next. Enos kissed the top of Samuel's head, and Amos lifted him, and the boy put both hands on his father's face in the proprietary way of 2-year-olds, and Amos bore it with complete equanimity, and looked at Inez over the boy's head with that smile, the real one, the one that had changed the architecture of her feelings, the first time she saw it in a coffee house in Caldwell in the spring of 1879. When he was the most feared man in the territory and the only one who had thought to stand up and offer her his chair. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. The light came through the east window and fell over all three of them, gold and ordinary and permanent, the light of a life that had found its fullness and knew it. And outside the roses were blooming along the south fence of a ranch that had been built from love and stubbornness, and the particular courage of two people who had decided that what was real and what was worth having were, in the end, the same thing.